Yasu, Kalisperas. Good afternoon. This is meant to be a workshop, but I'm going to give you a presentation. Thank you for listening to me in English. If you want to stop me at any point, please do, to ask a question. But let me just ask my own question to start with. How many of you are working on a cycle of reports at the moment for the outside world from companies? So maybe a third of the audience, thank you. And how many of you use Facebook often? More? And how many of you use, say, Twitter? That's some fairly strong patterns, because we've gone through some of that. What I'm going to talk about is a project that we've just completed that was launched in Amsterdam last month, looking at trends in transparency, in accountability, and in reporting over the next 10 years, so out to 2020. And again, just to repeat, if at any point there's something that I say that you don't understand or you want to challenge or dig deeper into, please do so. And at the end, I will also leave plenty of time for discussion. So a few words of introduction. I've been in this area for a very long time. I was just saying it's 40 years since I was last in Athens. I've been an environmentalist since 1961. I founded or co-founded my first company in 1978, Environmental Data Services. And what that was meant to do, and did quite successfully, was to begin to open up business on issues of safety, health, and environment. And very quickly, we found ourselves being asked by very major companies, including, I should say, BP, to come in and help them write their first environmental policy statements. Then in 1987, I set up another company called Traceability, and I'll talk a little bit about the agenda there in a moment. And then most recently, as was just mentioned, we've set up a new organization mainly to work with innovators and entrepreneurs and then bridge the work that they're doing, connect the work that they're doing into the world of mainstream business. And some of the clients and partners at Volans are shown on the screen. We're a very small organization. There are only 9 of us at the moment, based in London and Singapore. And then just a final thing. Some years back, about 3 years back, Fast Company, which is a magazine in the United States, which I really like, awarded us the Social Capitalist of the Year award. What was, I think, quite interesting was that was the first time that that award had ever gone to a selection of for-profit organizations or companies. Always before, social capitalism was seen to be only a not-for-profit activity. So you've seen this diagram already this morning. I had this developed a few years back to show not just the triple bottom line, which we came up with in 1994, but a concept that or a piece of language that we started to use the following year, 1995, which was people, planet, and profit. And in many ways, I think that's the way that institutions like the Global Reporting Initiative, like the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes, both of which I've been involved in since they began, that they followed. But in some ways, the project that we have just done is trying to look way beyond that triple bottom line. And in some ways, there are many different ways of cutting it. And I've been sitting in the audience today, at times quite uncomfortable, seeing all of these different presentations and wondering if you took all of these presentations and boiled them down into just a few diagrams or a few trend lines, what would that look like? But I'm just going, for the moment, to add to the complexity and add to the confusion. I think that if you look at the space that we're talking, the agenda that we're talking about today, which is corporate citizenship, corporate responsibility, CSR, 2.0, 2.1, 2 point whatever, then most of the companies that were first impacted by those agendas started off by being on the defensive, by being in denial. And I remember when we set up environmental data services in 1978, even though we had a parent company which was really well known in European business, it took us 9 months to get the first company to open up to us to talk about environment, because they thought anyone who was coming to talk to them about the environment was basically going for the throat. We may have been, but not always. So we went from denial to then a period where people thought, well, if we're going to have to do this, what do the regulators tell us to do? So that was a defensive compliance mindset. I think that this was done by a young colleague. I think this CSR agenda goes way further out this way than she has put it. But that was her perception. Her perception is that we are moving into something very different now. It's a period of what you could describe as social innovation. And companies do this. They try and change our behaviors in many different ways. But we're getting into a period now where companies are being asked to change our behavior in some quite dramatic ways. For example, they're being asked to help us stop smoking, stop drinking too much, stop driving too fast, stop getting too fat, stop having such big carbon and water footprints, stop getting HIV/AIDS. The list is getting really quite long. And the question is, firstly, are companies legitimate actors in that game, or should it be governments? And even if they are legitimate actors, how should they do what they're being asked to do? And at the top, what you've seen, and the work that I've done, when I first went into companies, you were really lucky if you got in, firstly, but then secondly, the people you would meet were lawyers or they were public relations people. And what's happened, within about 12 to 15 years, it was almost always a director that you saw first, because this stuff had started to become a bit more important. And now it's right up at what the Americans call the C-suite level, so the chief officers of the company, the chief executive, the chief operating officer, the chief financial officer. This is not true for the most part in Southern Europe. This is true to a limited degree in some countries in Northern Europe, certainly in Scandinavia, and it's increasingly true in North America. We can come back to that later on if you want. And then the question is, what's actually driving all of this? What's pushing all of this agenda forward? And again, we started a long time ago, the same year, 1994, to map the pressure waves in the developed countries that were pushing this agenda forward. And some of you may have seen an earlier version of this slide, but it goes from 1960, and what you see, again, I just emphasize, this is very much the OECD countries, although very often there was an echo effect in non-OECD countries and in places like Brazil or India or wherever. First wave, largely environmental, created a secondary wave of regulation. And these down waves are where the really interesting work tends to get done. In this wave, the second one, in 1988, with a colleague, I published a book called The Green Consumer Guide. That book, to our complete surprise, sold 1 million copies in 18 months, because it was a moment where ordinary people in countries around the world were getting very nervous about a number of the environmental issues. So, for example, the ozone depletion issue was a big controversy at the time. It would be nice, wouldn't it, if when in Greece you have these major fires, that the same consumer reaction happens. But it doesn't always, the connections aren't always made in people's minds in that way. What was different from this period to that one was this was governments and regulators and companies on the defensive. This was the market. This was consumers starting to call for action. And so through the period afterwards, that's when you had many of these new voluntary standards, the ISO standards, the Global Reporting Initiative, AA 1000, and so on, coming through. We believe there was a third wave building up until about 2001. This was about globalization and its impact. But then 9/11 happened, and much of that was pushed back into the box. Now again, if you look at the OECD world, so I'm thinking about countries also like Japan and Korea increasingly, what you've seen since is a very sharp recovery. But the focus is not simply now on corporate citizenship or CSR, it's on clean technology, on the green economy, on some areas like this. Now the question is, where are we headed next? My view is that we've already gone over the peak of that fourth wave and we're coming strongly down the slope. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that, as I've said before, is where much of the practical action starts to happen. Global Reporting Initiative was set up in 1997. And underlying this, we believe there's a fairly steady upward trajectory. Now, I sit on the board of the Global Reporting Initiative. I remain very interested in reporting, but it's not my mainstream activity. When I joined the GRI board about 2 years ago, I said I would only join on the basis that I could be provocative, challenging, and I personally do not think that annual printed reports from companies is going to give us the sorts of change that we need to see in the world. And we've heard that a number of times earlier on today. So the board said, fine, but where are we going to go over the next decade? And the project that I'm just going to take you through tries to address that. 3 companies helped us with the work by funding it. One was the Dow Chemical Company. And it was quite interesting. Just before we started this particular project, we had done a project for Dow in the United States, looking out to the year 2097, when Dow will be 200 years old. And they came to us with what seemed like a completely stupid question. What is the world going to be like in 2097? And we took a look at that, and it's actually, in some ways, easier than you might imagine to see some of the basics of where the world might take us. Novo Nordisk, Danish healthcare company, SAP, as many of you will know, as a software company. And I'll come back to them because they're coming into this CSR and sustainability space quite strongly. And then the report that we produced was launched at the GRI conference last month. So sustainability, the organization, which we founded in 1987, has focused on reporting for a very long time, since actually 1987. And we've done a series of programs engaging stakeholders. I think there are 30-some companies involved in that. More recently, Global Reporters, which is a benchmark, a ranking of different reports from around the world. But this is the new report that the Global Reporting Initiative have published. It's part of what they call a new explorations series, and it's no accident that the wing there has tiger stripes on it, because when we started to look at the big trends that we see influencing the transparency, the accountability and reporting initiative over the next decade, it fell into 6, and this is the year of the tiger. So without actually taking too much trouble, we put it into the TIGER's acronym. Now, everyone has mentioned BP, and I've mentioned them to say that I worked with them on their first ever environmental policy statement. I've worked with them on many other things, but what struck me when this thing first started to happen was not simply that this was an absolute catastrophe, nor that they had got things so badly wrong, and the regulators also. But why did they not respond in the sorts of ways that we've been discussing this morning? Because in one of the later sessions this morning, the crowdsourcing approach was discussed. why had they not put out their data sets? Why had they not asked people to contribute to that? In fact, they went completely the other way. They shut down the videos that were monitoring the oil coming out. So I think what we see is even leadership companies under stress going completely the wrong way. So the challenge is not just to get our companies and our organizations to commit to do the right thing, it's to get them to do the right thing when the pressure really comes on. Now, so the tigers start with a T, and that for us is traceability. And I think within 4 or 5 years, I would be really surprised if you do not see many companies reporting onto iPad-like platforms. It makes so much sense. You can just download whatever the latest communication is from the company that you're interested in. You can then click on different aspects of it. It's infinitely more powerful and flexible than printed reports. Does this mean that printed reports will disappear? I think in some places, yes, but I think many people will continue to do some form of printed publication. It makes sense. And then I think you may have seen in an earlier slide presentation today a version of the Good Guide technology. How many people here have heard of the Good Guide app? 1, 2. So forgive me if I just very quickly run through it. There was a guy called Dara O'Rourke who was based at Berkeley University, and what he started to do was to think of a technology. So it's a cell phone, and in the cell phone is a barcode scanner, so you can put it over any product that has a barcode. And then into the database behind all of this, they put public databases, private databases, NGO databases. And so, for example, if you're a diabetic and you're interested in foods that you should or should not eat, this gives you that answer. If you're worried about animal rights, and this isn't just about products, this is about the companies behind the products, and it's about, to some degree, over time, about their value chains. So this is enormously powerful challenge to companies. Anyway, Dara launched the company Good Guide. Venture capitalists have backed it. But the thing I thought was very, very interesting was when Walmart were approached with this technology. And they were simply being asked whether they would put some of their information on the system. And they had a panic attack. They thought, well, do we really want consumers to come round our stores and start challenging our stocking policy, what we have on the shelves, where we put it on the shelves, and so on. So I would expect over the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see many retailers, many supermarket groups, putting that technology into the shopping trolleys. So you actually have access to it as you go around. Or you have access, and you have access through their websites. This is enormously powerful. It won't just be Good Guide. There will be many other people who do the same. And the question is, how do the manufacturers, how do the people who produce get into these environments and influence the way in which their products and reputations are seen? I said I'd come back to SAP, the German software company. Have any of you seen their latest sustainability report, which was published about 5 weeks ago? Two people. For me, the most interesting part by far of that report, and it's available online in an interactive format, is this. Can I assume that most people know what materiality means? It means an impact or an issue that has financial relevance or significance to a company. This is the SAP materiality analysis. Now, many companies have been doing materiality matrices like this. What's really, really different about this one is what SAP have done here, and on the vertical axis, this is the level of importance to the stakeholder universe, and the further right you go, the greater the impact on the relevant business. So these are SAP's results. So health and safety, relatively small number of stakeholders affected, so employees and families, but huge impact on the company potentially. They've also opened this up. So any stakeholder can put in their own assessment of the material issues for SAP. Now, I think that's some sort of revolution, because what you can then do is play off the company's assessment of the priority issues and the agenda against that of different sets of stakeholders. So I think this is really quite exciting. The question is, will people actually use it? And that's an experiment we've only just begun. And just as part of this GRI project, we did some of you may have responded, and if so, thank you very much. We went out to the entire GRI community around the world, and we asked a series of different questions. And so when we asked a question around what sort of formats people are currently most using, and this is just in the GRI reporting community, it's interesting that the dedicated website comes just slightly ahead of printed reports, electronic newsletters, very similar. And then lower down, you've got blogging, Facebook, Twitter, some of the other things that we talked about very early on. I think this one's interesting. I think Google Earth is going to explode. It may not be Google Earth, it may be something like it, but people will start to report in ways that enable people to see the locations, interact with people in the local community. And then this, and I'm sorry for the small size of the print, even I'm having difficulty reading it, shows a quite dramatically different. This is looking out into the future. Where do people think reporting is going next? Much stronger focus on web-based and downloadable reporting, printed reports coming back a bit. This one is the surprise for me, XBRL type reporting, where you tag the information so that the stakeholder or user of your reporting can actually create their own report just by putting in the relevant search terms. Does anyone in the room today produce a report that uses XBRL? So one. I'd love to talk to you afterwards, but you may tell us that that's in the discussion period. I'd love to see what your experience is, but I think that has to be the future, even if, to start with, it's quite complex. The G in Tigers is governments. If you work for government, you like governments. If you don't, you tend not to like them. But it's increasingly clear that governments have a really important role to play. And that the one example I've pulled out here is Denmark. Because in Denmark, they now have this requirement of business of several thousand of the biggest companies. You either have to report or you have to explain why you don't report. And I think we'll see more and more countries going that route. And I think it's necessary. I think we cannot any longer simply rely on the goodwill of companies to report on a voluntary basis. We have to force disclosure, we have to force reporting, and then we have to use the data, the information, the intelligence that's produced. So we have to aggregate. And there are people who are in the private sector who are aggregating the data, but governments also, I think, have to play a crucial role in all of that. And one reason why they have to play that aggregation role is that this is still very often about big environmental challenges. And business is pretty poor very often at dealing with those really big ones. This was some work that was done last year by the Stockholm Resilience Institute, or Stockholm Resilience Center. And this was ahead of the Climate Change Summit in Copenhagen. And what you see here is 9 big environmental challenges. Climate change is there, but it's interesting that the one that is really out of control is biodiversity loss. This is the year of biodiversity. and the nitrogen cycle. So not necessarily things that you would automatically think about. And if you're a company, you wouldn't necessarily, even if you were a fertilizer company, necessarily be linking your emissions and the releases of nitrogen from your products back into the nitrogen cycle. And the problem here is every time you come across one of these boundaries, you weaken, you make it harder for society to deal with the other ones. So I think increasingly governments have to remind us of that context. Ranking, rating, these sorts of surveys have been mentioned by a number of people earlier on today. As I said, I was involved for about 7 or 8 years in the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes. I think they're about the best framework that we have, but you're seeing a huge amount of competition coming up. So some of it's just background noise, just everyone wants to be part of this. But I've just joined the panel to take the Newsweek Greenest Company ranking scheme, which in its first year, last year, was just focused on the United States. It's now going international. And I think we'll see more and more of the business media coming into this space. Now, the question has already been asked earlier on this morning. How good are these different rankings and ratings? And if a company can see itself high up here and low down there, doesn't that undermine all of this? And the answer is, well, it should certainly make you critical or skeptical about the assessment and about the results. But this is how markets operate. People want to see where businesses that they invest in, buy from, work for, rank against others. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and not just ranking of companies or of products as in good guide, but also increasingly countries. And the final, the S in Tigers, was the darker side of our economies, the corruption, the mafia, the trade in illegal goods and services, weapons, drugs, and so on. The reason why I've put a certain flag here is simply that from outside Greece, people are interpreting what's in the process of happening here. And you're not alone. It's happening in other countries as well. And my personal view is that what has started here, in Europe at least, is going to impact other countries, including my own country of Britain, much harder than most people currently expect. So why is it happening? Now, there are many reasons. One is that we don't like to vote for politicians who tell us things that we do not want to hear, or who want to force us to do things that we do not want to do. But from outside Greece, corruption is seen to be a major factor in what's happening here. There just aren't the feedback mechanisms, the transparency and accountability mechanisms that there need to be. And when I first put that issue in, the GRI people were really quite nervous about having it in. And then we tested it with the GRI community, and it came through very, very strongly indeed. So this isn't just me, this is that group of people talking.